Walter Thompson had seen a lot in his 92 years. From the battlefields of WWII to the quieter battles of old age, he thought he had faced every challenge life could throw at him. But on this quiet afternoon, as he sat in his small, cozy living room, enjoying a cup of tea, the phone rang. Little did he know that this call would lead him into a new kind of fight, one that would test his wits, his patience, and his resolve. "Hello, Mr. Thompson. This is Officer Daniels from the Social Security office. We've detected suspicious activity on your account, and we're here to help you avoid any legal trouble," said the voice on the other end. It was calm, professional, but something about it felt off to Walter. He smiled, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years. His instincts told him this wasn't a real officer. This was a scammer. And instead of hanging up, Walter decided to play along. "Oh dear," Walter said, his voice shaky, mimicking the fear he knew the scammer expected. "What should I do?" The scammer, sensing an easy target, continued confidently. "We need you to verify some information first. If you could just provide your Social Security number and banking details, we can clear this right up." Walter's grip tightened on the phone. He had spent his life serving his country, protecting others from harm. Now, it seemed, he had one more battle to fight. But this time it wasn't on a battlefield. It was on the phone. Of course," Walter replied, keeping his voice unsteady. "Let me just grab my papers." As he pretended to fumble through his drawers, Walter's mind raced. He needed to keep the scammer on the line long enough to gather information, but without raising suspicion. And so, the game began. Walter's hand shook as he rifled through the papers in his drawer, not out of fear, but out of focus. It had been years since his military days, but the sharp mind that helped him survive behind enemy lines was now fully engaged. He knew one thing. Scammers fed on fear and confusion, but he had neither. The voice on the phone was confident, yet cold, as the scammer continued pressing Walter for details. "Take your time, Mr. Thompson. Just be sure to provide your full name, Social Security number, and your bank's routing number. We'll get this all cleared up for you." Walter chuckled to himself, his voice still low and trembling as he spoke. "Oh, yes. I don't want any trouble. Just give me a moment." As he continued to stall, he scribbled down details about the scammer's tactics, the smoothness of the approach, the casual authority the scammer tried to project, the way he crafted a sense of urgency. Walter was a man of strategy, and now his mind was working overdrive, devising a plan. He kept the scammer talking, playing the role of a confused elderly man, a role that he knew was all too familiar to scammers like this. "I'm not very good with computers," Walter said, his voice wavering. "Do you need me to send anything through email?" The scammer, sensing he was dealing with an easy mark, leaned in further. "That won't be necessary for now, Mr. Thompson. We just need to verify some basic information, and I'll guide you through the rest. Now, about your bank account." But Walter wasn't listening anymore. He was already setting his own trap. As the call dragged on, Walter decided it was time to loop in some help. His grandson, David, was a tech-savvy cybersecurity expert who had been warning him about these scams for years. Walter had never imagined he'd be caught in one. Yet here he was, with a scammer on the line. "Let me call my bank to check on this," Walter said, his voice filled with false concern. "No need for that, Mr. Thompson," the scammer interrupted quickly. "If you hang up, it'll delay everything. Just give me the information now, and we'll take care of it." But Walter had no intention of hanging up. Instead, he pressed the mute button on his phone and dialed David from his landline. "David," Walter whispered when his grandson picked up, "I'm on the line with a scammer. I need your help." David's response was immediate. "Grandpa, don't give them any information. Are you safe?" Walter smiled. "Of course, I'm just playing along." David sighed, relieved but worried. "Okay, let me get into my system. I can start tracing the call while you keep him talking. Don't let him know what's happening." Walter returned to the phone. "I'm sorry for the delay," he said, unmuting the scammer. "This is all just very confusing. Can you explain again what information you need?" As Walter continued to stall, David worked furiously to trace the call, hoping to uncover the source of the scam. But they both knew they had to move quickly. Scammers didn't stick around once they sensed something was wrong. The scammer, growing impatient, pressed Walter harder. "Mr. Thompson, we're running out of time. If you don't verify your information now, your Social Security benefits will be suspended, and you may face legal action." Walter chuckled under his breath. "Legal action, you say? Well, I certainly don't want that. Let me just—" Before he could finish, David's voice came through on the other line. "Grandpa, I've got him. The call's being routed through an international server. I'm flagging it with the authorities now, but we need more." Walter, sensing the endgame was near, decided to push the scammer a little harder. "You know, young man," he said, his voice suddenly steadier, more commanding, "I served in the war. I've been through things that would make your head spin. You think I'm going to fall for a little scam like this?" The scammer was silent for a beat, clearly caught off guard by Walter's change in tone. "I know what you're doing," Walter continued, his voice firm. "I've been around too long to be fooled by someone like you, and right now, my grandson is tracing this call. You might want to hang up before the authorities show up at your door." The line went dead. Walter smiled. With the call over, Walter and David began piecing together the details they had gathered. David, with his expertise, worked to track down more information about the scammer's operation. What they discovered shocked them both. The scammer was part of a larger international ring, targeting elderly individuals across the country. Walter knew they couldn't stop at just protecting themselves. They had to help others avoid falling into the same trap. He contacted local authorities, who began investigating the scam based on the information they had provided. News of Walter's takedown of the scammer spread quickly through the community. Suddenly, the quiet 92-year-old veteran became a local hero. Seniors reached out to thank him, and he was invited to speak at events about how to recognize and avoid scams. Walter, never one for the spotlight, humbly accepted, knowing that his story might help others. At one of these events, Walter spoke passionately. "I may be 92, he said, "but that doesn't mean I'm weak. No one is too old to stand up for themselves, and no one should ever feel powerless." As Walter's story gained traction, he found a new sense of purpose. He continued working with his grandson to expose other scam operations, using his experience and David's tech skills to help protect vulnerable communities. Together, they became a powerful team, combining old-school wisdom with modern technology to outsmart scammers at every turn. Just when Walter thought his work was done, a new scam emerged, one even more complex than before. This time, it wasn't just targeting individuals, it was exploiting entire families. Walter and David knew they had to act quickly, but this time the stakes were even higher. As they dove deeper into the new operation, they uncovered ties to a global criminal syndicate. The fight wasn't over, but Walter was ready for the next challenge. Walter sat by his window, the sunlight filtering through the blinds as he sipped his coffee. He had always been a man of routine, and despite his recent success in outsmarting the scammers, he enjoyed the simple pleasures of everyday life. But today, his mind wasn't at ease. David had shared the troubling news with him. The scam they had exposed was just the tip of the iceberg. A larger, more dangerous criminal syndicate was operating behind the scenes. "Grandpa," David had said during their last call, "this goes deeper than we thought. These guys aren't just after money. They're targeting entire communities, and their methods are getting more sophisticated." Walter had nodded, feeling a familiar tension in his chest. He had spent his life fighting battles, first on the battlefield, and now in a world that was just as dangerous but less visible. He wasn't one to back down from a fight, but this new challenge felt more daunting. The criminals were using advanced technology, manipulating systems and exploiting vulnerabilities on a global scale. Walter knew they couldn't do this alone. "Do you have any leads?" Walter asked, his voice steady despite the unease he felt. "Not yet," David replied, frustration clear in his tone. "But I'm working on it. I flagged a few suspicious accounts and I'm digging through their digital trails. It's just, these guys are good. They cover their tracks well." Walter thought for a moment, then leaned forward. What if we think bigger, David? What if we don't just wait for them to make a mistake? What if we start making moves, putting pressure on them to come out of hiding? David hesitated. Grandpa, these aren't just small-time scammers. These are dangerous people. We're talking about organized crime. You can't just call them out and expect them to fold. Walter's lips curled into a smile. That's exactly what we're going to do. We need to show them that we're not afraid, that we know how they operate. Trust me, David. I've faced enemies like this before. The key is making them think you're always one step ahead. Walter and David began strategizing. Their goal was to lure the criminals out into the open, to expose their operation by making them think they had a major security breach. David, with his technical skills, hacked into one of the syndicate's low-level accounts, creating a false trail that would lead the criminals to believe they were being targeted by a rival group. Meanwhile, Walter made a series of carefully timed phone calls, posing as a middleman for a rival organization that wanted to disrupt their operations. The plan was risky. If the criminals figured out what they were doing, they could retaliate. But Walter was confident. He had spent years dealing with people who relied on fear and intimidation, and he knew how to handle them. The key was to stay calm, to never show weakness. As the plan unfolded, Walter and David watched closely, monitoring the syndicate's reactions. At first, there was no response, just silence, which was almost more unnerving than anything. But then, slowly, they started to see movement. The criminals began shifting their assets, transferring money between accounts in an attempt to cover their tracks. It was exactly what Walter and David had hoped for. "We've got them," David said, excitement in his voice. "I'm tracking the transfers now. We're close, Grandpa." Walter nodded, his heart racing. They were so close to bringing down the operation, but he knew they couldn't celebrate yet. The syndicate was clever, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, Walter received an unexpected call. It was a voice he didn't recognize. Calm, authoritative, and deeply unsettling. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said, "we know what you've been up to. It would be wise for you to stop now before things get complicated." Walter's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice steady. The voice chuckled darkly. "Don't play games with us, Mr. Thompson. You're a smart man, smart enough to know when you're in over your head. You may have outsmarted a few low-level scammers, but this is bigger than you, bigger than your grandson. Walk away, and we'll forget this ever happened." Walter felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. "I don't take orders from criminals," he said firmly. "If you think you can intimidate me, you're sorely mistaken." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then, the voice spoke again, colder this time. "You've made your choice. Don't say we didn't warn you." The line went dead. Walter sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. He knew this was a turning point. The criminals weren't just trying to cover their tracks anymore, they were actively coming after him. But that only strengthened his resolve. Walter knew they needed more support. The criminals were powerful, and while he and David had managed to disrupt their operations, they couldn't take them down alone. That's when Walter reached out to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, but who had the connections and the skills they needed. Colonel James Carter had served with Walter during the war. After retiring from the military, he had gone on to work in law enforcement, specializing in cybercrime and organized crime. If anyone could help them take down the syndicate, it was him. Walter made the call, and within hours, Colonel Carter was on a plane, heading to meet with him and David. The reunion was bittersweet. Both men had seen too much in their lifetimes, and this new battle felt all too familiar. "Walter," Carter said as they sat down to discuss the situation, "you always find a way to land yourself in the middle of trouble." Walter chuckled. "I didn't go looking for this, James. But now that we're in it, I need your help to finish it." Carter nodded, his expression serious. "You've got it. But we need to be smart about this. These aren't just small-time criminals. They've got connections, resources. We'll need to gather solid evidence, something that ties them directly to their higher-ups." With Carter's expertise and David's technical skills, the trio began planning their next move. They knew the syndicate was watching them closely, but they were ready to fight back. As the weeks passed, Walter, David, and Colonel Carter worked tirelessly to expose the syndicate's operations. They uncovered a network of scams, money laundering, and cybercrime that stretched across multiple countries. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. But they were relentless, determined to bring the criminals to justice. Their efforts finally paid off when they discovered a key piece of evidence, an encrypted communication between the syndicate's leaders discussing their next big move. It was the break they had been waiting for. Carter immediately contacted his old colleagues in law enforcement, and a task force was assembled to take down the syndicate. The operation was complex, involving coordinated raids in several cities at once. Walter and David were kept in the loop, but they knew their role was to stay behind the scenes. This was a battle that required an army. The day of the operation arrived, and the tension was palpable. Walter, David, and Carter waited anxiously for news from the task force. Hours passed, and then, finally, the call came in. The syndicate's leaders had been arrested, their operation dismantled. The relief was overwhelming. After months of planning and strategy, they had succeeded. The criminals who had preyed on the vulnerable were behind bars, and their network had been destroyed. For Walter, it was more than just a victory. It was a reminder that no matter how old you were, no matter how outmatched you seemed, you could always make a difference. He had stood up against the odds and won. With the syndicate taken down, life returned to a sense of normalcy for Walter. But he knew that his fight wasn't over. Scammers and criminals would always be out there looking for new ways to exploit people. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would be there to stop them. He continued working with David and Colonel Carter, helping to raise awareness about scams and cybercrime. They gave talks at community centers, hosted online workshops, and even worked with law enforcement to improve their strategies for dealing with scammers. Walter had found a new purpose, and it gave him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a protector, a guide, and an advocate for those who couldn't defend themselves. As he sat by his window one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Walter smiled to himself. He had lived a long, full life, and though his body was slowing down, his mind was as sharp as ever. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because as long as there were people like him, people who refused to be beaten down by fear, there was always hope. Months passed after the syndicate's takedown, and Walter Thompson's life had returned to a quiet normalcy. Yet, it was a new kind of peace, one earned through perseverance, bravery, and the strength of standing up against injustice. Walter had thought his fighting days were long behind him, but this experience had reignited something inside him, a sense of purpose that filled his heart with pride. David continued his work in cybersecurity, consulting with government agencies and private firms on how to protect against scammers and cybercrime. Colonel Carter had returned to his retirement but remained a close friend, always available for advice or a shared memory of their military days. One evening, as Walter sat on his porch, sipping a glass of iced tea, David came to visit. His grandson had grown into a man Walter couldn't be more proud of. Brilliant, kind-hearted, and with a sense of justice that mirrored his own. "How are you feeling, Grandpa?" David asked, sitting down beside him. Walter gave a small chuckle. "I'm old, David, but I'm good. I'm at peace." David nodded, understanding the depth of his words. The chaos of the past year had settled, and now all that was left was the calm of having made a real difference. "I've been thinking," David said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe we could start something together, an organization that educates people on scams and helps protect the vulnerable. We've seen firsthand how bad things can get, and I think we could help a lot of people." Walter smiled, feeling the warmth of David's idea. "That sounds like something worth doing, David, and I'd be honored to be part of it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunset turn the sky into a canvas of oranges and purples. For Walter, it was the perfect ending to a life filled with challenges, triumphs, and the unbreakable bond of family. "I've learned something through all of this," David said, breaking the silence. It's not about how strong or young you are. It's about using your mind, your experience, and your heart to make the world better. Walter nodded slowly. That's right, and you're well on your way to doing just that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had faced down enemies both seen and unseen, and through it all, he had never wavered in his belief that good people, no matter their age or circumstances, could change the world. "Let's get to work," Walter said, his voice steady with resolve. And, as they began discussing their plans for the future, Walter knew that while his battles might be different now, the fight for justice and protecting the vulnerable was a legacy he could proudly pass on to his grandson. It wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Walter Thompson's story is a powerful reminder that no matter your age or background, standing up against injustice and protecting those who are vulnerable can make a lasting impact. Whether it's outsmarting scammers or helping others stay safe, we all have the ability to make the world a better place. If you found Walter's journey inspiring, share this story with someone who could use a little reminder that wisdom and experience are powerful tools. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that empower, uplift, and remind us all of the impact we can have on the world around us. Together, let's keep learning, growing, and standing up for what's right.